everyone. My name is Dr. Ananya Chakravarti, and I'm Associate Professor of History at Georgetown University, and I'm also the Operations Lead for Ideas and Research for Radical Exchange Foundation. In this slideshow, I want to walk you through how you might help document the unfolding of COVID-19 with a view to creating an archive of the present crisis. Before we start, I wanted to say a few words about how I, as a historian, consider events as they occur in the present. Historians study change over time, and so in general, we are unwilling to judge the significance of an event as it unfolds, since we cannot know how things will change, and so what seems important now may end up having very little impact in the future, while trivial events can have vast effects over time. Still, what we're witnessing is clearly something that I'm confident in calling an event of world historical magnitude, given its scale, both geographically and in terms of wide-ranging social impact. Histories of disease have value not just for historians, but for epidemiologists and other medical researchers, public health professionals, and policymakers. So in that spirit, I'd like to use what we know as historians to document as best we can COVID-19 for the benefit of future historians of this event. To understand why I'm calling COVID-19 an event of world historical magnitude, let's try to visualize the scale of this disease. First, we have a map from the World Health Organization's Situation Report from 19 March 2020, showing the distribution of confirmed cases of COVID-19 across the world. As you can see, there are very few parts of the world that have not been affected by this illness. Secondly, we have a post here by David Caretta in which he compared obituaries from two editions of the newspaper L'Eco Libero. In the first, only one page of the newspaper is dedicated to obituaries. In the second, dating from March 13, 2020, just a few days after the first edition that he shows us, 10 pages of the paper are dedicated to obituaries. The impact of COVID-19, therefore, on certain communities around the world are already at catastrophic levels.
Buongiorno cari amici, così solo per darvi un'idea di come siamo messi, l'Eco di Bergamo domenica 9 febbraio, una pagina e un qualcosina. Andiamo invece a guardare l'Eco di Bergamo di oggi, venerdì 13 marzo. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 e 10. Una semplice influenza. Grazie.
In this light, as we think about archiving a world historical event like COVID-19, I want to walk you through a basic introduction to archives and primary sources. So, primary sources are historical documents or artifacts that have survived from the past and that provide first-hand evidence of past events. They are created at the same time as the event that we are interested in studying. They can include letters, diaries, and other personal papers, documents created by governments and other institutions, newspapers, maps. They can also be different media, including audiovisual recordings such as photographs or sound recordings or video. Increasingly now, they can include digital artifacts like news or tweet posts, and they can also include material artifacts ranging all the way to architecture. For historians, we're especially usually interested in text, but increasingly, as I'll talk about in a minute, the nature of our archives are changing, and digital artifacts are becoming increasingly important. An archive is simply a repository of these historical documents or primary sources. Here, if you take a minute to read this, I'm going to give you a few examples of primary sources, and the example that I'm going to use is the event of the Spanish flu of 1918. Here we have a letter that Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi wrote to one Ganga Ben, which was preserved by his personal secretary, Mahadev Haribhai Desai, in his diary. And he quoted the letter in its entirety. Gandhi wrote, "I could read only today your card telling me that you, Kiki, and others had fallen ill. I was glad to learn, however, that by the grace of God you are all progressing. The body of the person who has chosen to follow the dharma of service must become as strong as steel as a result of his holy work. Our ancestors could build such tough bodies in the past. But today we are reduced to a state of miserable weakness and are easily infected by noxious germs moving about in the air. There is one and only one really effective way in which we can save ourselves from them even in our present broken state of health. That way is the way of self-restraint, or of imposing a limit on our acts. The doctors say, and they are right, that in influenza our body is safest from any risk to life if we attend to two things. Even after we feel that we have recovered, we must continue to take complete rest in bed and have only an easily digestible liquid food. So early as on the third day after the fever has subsided, many persons resume their work and their usual diet. The result is a relapse, and quite often a fatal relapse. I request you all, therefore, to keep your beds for some days still, and I wish you kept me informed about the health of you all. I am myself confined to bed still. It appears I shall have to keep to it for many days more, but it can be said that I am getting better. The doctors have forbidden me even to dictate letters, but how could I have the heart to desist from writing to you?" So for a historian, seeing the Spanish flu through Gandhi's eyes is interesting for various reasons, not least because it gives us a sense, personally, a very intimate sense of how the disease was experienced by people, but also because of Gandhi's own importance in South Asian history, the fact that here you can see again themes in his larger political thought, including the fact that he saw modern civilization itself as a kind of illness for which the cure required a certain type of self-discipline that was expressed both spiritually and in terms of political and personal practice. As historians of earlier pandemics, but really all historians know, no archive is ever complete. So we know, for example, with the Spanish flu, that we have huge gaps in what people experienced. Archives also reflect the records of those with the social, political, and economic resources to produce and preserve documents, and conversely to suppress the points of view of those who were inconvenient to them. So our historical archives underrepresent those who were socially vulnerable and marginalized, for example, women, or slaves, or the poor, or those who were non-literate. Historians know this and have developed techniques to address it. Still, any archive of COVID-19 will reflect the hierarchies of our societies and will ironically underrepresent those most vulnerable to its ravages. Migrant and precarious workers, including day laborers and workers in the gig economy, non-literate peoples, people without reliable access to the internet, the infirm, the elderly, and those incarcerated in prisons or immigration detention centers, those living in refugee camps, the homeless, etc. Still, the more we preserve from as wide a set of points of view as possible, the more information historians of the future will have to make sense of our time. Here is another primary source where we can see how the Spanish flu was actually deliberately silenced in Italy. This is a circular that the then Italian Prime Minister Vittorio Emanuele Orlando sent on October 20th, 1918 to prefects, communicating the order voted upon that day by the Supreme Council of Health, again affirming that the terrible epidemic was nothing but the flu. Orlando wished by this folklore to continue to spread the official line that the sickness was not, in fact, some new terrible epidemic. He wrote, "With this statement, the board of directors explicitly intended to oppose the rumors that arose and spread from the first hint around a larger and more intense manifestation of the morbid epidemic form, which had appeared to us since last spring. Since then, there has been talk of a terrible, mysterious disease, unknown in its cause and invisible in its effects. Now, it is a question for us, as it has been in other countries, of arbitrary, absurd voices, the result of incompetence and a fantastic overexcitement." So, I want us to be aware that silences are created in the archive not only because of what is left out, but also because there were deliberate policies put in place in that time to try to silence voices. Archives are also fragile. They can be destroyed either deliberately through acts of vandalism or arson. Most famously, for example, in the one of the proximate causes of the civil war in Sri Lanka was the destruction of the Jaffna Public Library. But they can also be destroyed through neglect. Most recently, the fire in the National Museum of Brazil destroyed not only one of the most significant collections for Brazilian history, but also one of the most important collections of indigenous history in the Americas. Archives are therefore only as durable as the materials in which sources are made and preserved. And this is not always intuitive. So, for example, records written in the 19th century or early 20th century may actually be more vulnerable to decay than 17th century records, simply because the quality of the paper was much more robust in the earlier period. Also, do not assume that digital materials are automatically more secure. A lot of digital content has already been effectively lost. Our society's historical footprint has also changed dramatically, and any archiving that we do now has to take this into account. Over half of the world's population is online. Any archive of the present has to include born digital materials. The digital archives of the future, however, are also databases of the present. As we know, companies routinely profit off the data we generate without compensating us, even when we are unaware that we are generating data, for example, in the case of location data generated in apps like Uber. More worryingly, states around the world, often with the collusion of such companies, most notably Facebook, have used this data for purposes of surveillance. When we amass digital records, even for the purposes of archiving, we must be aware that there are databases vulnerable to both sorts of exploitation. And we should be considering anonymizing sources, particularly those that provide information to people who are socially and politically vulnerable, to protect information if necessary. Still, democratizing access to reliable information is important both for the future and now, when misinformation, often deliberately spread for political gain or private profit, can exacerbate a pandemic with catastrophic consequences. Here again, we can think about an example from a historical period. Here is an advertisement made by the M.J. Breitenbach Company for their product called Pepto-Mangan, a dietary supplement of iron and manganese, which was promising at this time to be a restorative for the Spanish flu. In the late 1890s, the company had gained prominence by promising to market the supplement only to pharmacists and not the general public. Very soon, however, the company was advertising publicly its products. In response, repeatedly, professional associations, such as the American Medical Association, had condemned the company's false claims. A report by the American Medical Association in 1917 stated, "It has been pointed out many times in the pages of the journal that many nostrums are advertised first to physicians and that after physicians have served as the unpaid agents of the manufacturers in introducing the preparations, their exploitation is then commonly continued by means of advertisements in the public press. This plan has been followed successfully in so many cases that we now have come to look on it as a regular course. It is in keeping with this rule that we find peptide mangan now advertised in the public press, the physicians having served the manufacturer's purpose. So, what can we do as we are witnessing COVID-19 around the world? And we can actually transform ourselves from overwhelmed passive witnesses into active observers. In witnessing history, think about yourself as a participant on two levels. First, the personal. Documenting your personal experience is valuable, not only for archival purposes, but as a technique for coping in times of crisis. So you can also think of yourself as documenting as a member of different communities. We are each of us part of different communities, families, immediate and extended, friend circles, generational peer groups, collegial groups and professional associations, local religious communities and the wider ecumene, volunteer groups, neighborhood associations, online communities. As members of these communities, we're in a position to witness and document how each community experiences in response to COVID-19. Furthermore, depending on the scope of the communities in which we participate, be mindful that we're witnessing the unfolding of a social process at different scales, local, regional, national, and global. The techniques we might employ to document this will depend on both the scale of what we're documenting and how we interact with the communities in which we participate. The first technique that I want to talk about is journaling. For historians, the personal diary is one of our favorite genres of primary sources because it gives us a particularly intimate way of tracking change over time and understanding the past. Journaling involves writing regularly without worrying too much about the form or even the particular content or theme of what you write, but instead allowing thoughts, feelings, memories, and observations to play out on the page as they come to your mind. A good diarist will bring curiosity rather than judgment to the task. That's particularly important if we consider journaling as a coping mechanism at a time like this. Journaling offers us a private place in which we can freely express our reactions in a way that we can then revisit and reflect upon, so that we can better identify both our needs at a time like this, but also our strengths. It all provides us a sense of agency as we transform ourselves from passive witnesses into active observers. In thinking about this technique, consider also making art and not just writing as a way of recording our personal experience. Here we have an example by the artist Edvard Munch of his self-portrait with the Spanish flu, painted in 1919. It is what not only is this beautiful piece of art significant as an artistic object, but it is one of the few pieces of art that have survived, that was made by a survivor of the Spanish flu. The second thing is what do we do with content that we ourselves do not generate? So here, curating and cataloging becomes really important. We're bombarded with content on COVID-19, from emails and press releases to memes and tweet storms. A deluge of text is being produced, particularly in digital form. The best collections from a working historian's point of view are focused on content so that historians can view change over time. So I would suggest that we prioritize a few key sources that will allow us to make sense of this crisis at various scales. Collections are only as useful as the catalogs by which we can make sense of their contents. So every time you add to your collection, make sure you catalog it in detail. Consider including an overview of the contents of the collection you built, including dates and locations where material was collected, the types of materials, the number of items in your collection, significant thematic foci, and items of particular interest or rarity. For each item, make a detailed report of the type of material. Is it a photograph, a diary, a sound recording, etc.? The information about its provenance, where, when, who why was that piece created, any potential copyright information, as well as current storage condition. Make additional notes if you have physical condition on the physical condition of items, especially if there is damage already. As you're thinking about how to collect strategically, think about how this crisis is unfolding at several scales. First, let's consider the scale of the global. We generally have a difficult time visualizing or making sense of global connectivity from our particular locations. But even as national borders are closing around us, the world is self-evidently knit together tightly enough to make this pandemic possible. Still, documenting this for any one person is not possible. Instead, choose an institution or community of global reach that you participate in to follow closely. For example, if you're a member of Radical Exchange, you know that you have chapters around the world with similar members. You can also consider following an online fan fiction community, or a nonprofit or volunteer group that you support, or a religious activity that you are a part of. Preserve content generated by that community that seems of particular significance to you. Take screenshots or printouts of emails, download memes, preserve physical pamphlets, etc. Similarly, we can think about how COVID-19 plays out at the national scale. While many of us are in countries where we can trust our government institutions to preserve official national documents, this is not always the case. If you are in a place where it is unlikely that official pronouncements are going to be preserved, you might consider making recordings of such pronouncements. For those of us in places where the governments do preserve documents, we can still think about how we can record our personal experience of COVID-19 as members of nations. If you found yourself in a foreign country during this time, how did your embassy communicate with you? If you're a member of a national professional association or a union, how did that organization respond to the crisis? For those of us in the U.S., how is voting in the Democratic Party's primary elections in your state affected by COVID-19? Think about your own entry point into the national body politic and figuring out how you want to document this process at the scale of the nation. When we think about collecting at the scale of the local, one of the things that we can consider as a source are our local newspapers. However, as newspapers have become increasingly monopolistic markets, many local newspapers have collapsed. So that in the U.S., for example, as national papers like the New York Times and Washington Post have grown, local city papers have struggled in recent days. As a result, not only has the production of local news dwindled, but their futures as safe archival repositories have become more doubtful. If you have a local newspaper, particularly in a vernacular language you can read, consider subscribing to it and preserve articles related to COVID-19. Subscribing into a local newspaper is also a good way to support a local business that might have trouble surviving a crisis of this magnitude. As we consider how COVID-19 is unfolding, we have to take into account that different people will be affected differently by this disease. One of the tragedies of COVID-19 is the particular vulnerability of the elderly. This is a tragedy not just from a human point of view, but because we're faced with the possibility that we will lose generational memory at a catastrophic pace. Therefore, even as we practice social isolation, consider collecting oral histories from older relatives, neighbors, and community members that you may be in touch with by recording conversations with them. Always receive their permission to do so first, and explain why you're doing so. It's also a good idea to record this permission in some way, either as part of the video or audio recording that you make of their interview, or as a separate written consent form. Ask them about their memories of earlier public health crises, or what they heard from their parents and grandparents about such crises. Here we have a spot created by the Baylor Institute for Oral History with interviews that they conducted with Spanish flu pandemic survivors. What's really interesting is that through this technique, they managed to capture the voices of children who survived this pandemic. In documentary archives, children's voices are often underrepresented, but the technique of oral history allows us to understand how children experience this event.
This is Living Stories, featuring voices from the collections of the Baylor University Institute for Oral History. I'm Kim Patterson. When the Great War came to an end in late 1918, a cloud hung over the jubilation. The world was suffering the worst pandemic in history. From 1918 to 1919, the Spanish flu killed more people than the fighting did in World War I and infected more than a quarter of all Americans. Educator Wilma Bunton describes the flu striking her family in the Houston area.
And I remember my older brother Louis was the only one who didn't get sick. So he'd try to fix something for us for breakfast, or he'd try to fix something for supper. None of us were interested whatsoever. They didn't have a doctor there, so you just had to do what you thought you could, and they knew to drink fruit juices and rest. Then he'd cry when he'd fix something. He said, "It's because I can't do a good job of cooking. You all are not eating."
In a 1987 interview, Louis Mayberry recalls how the virus changed everyday life for children.
When we moved to San Antonio, I started school. I hadn't gone to school for a few days. They had a flu epidemic in San Antonio. They turned the schools out, and we stayed out for quite a while. They was trying to teach me how to work. They let me shine shoes at the INGN station. In those days, it's Missouri Pacific now. And then school started again, and it went on for a couple of weeks, and they turned out again. We didn't get much schooling before Christmas.
Bible translator Robert Bratcher, who was born in Brazil in 1920, tells how the illness affected travel.
My parents and my older brother, who was at that time 4 years old, had gone to Brazil in 1919. They had been appointed by the Foreign Mission Board and were due to go to 1918, but the great flu epidemic was at that time, and it held them up. They stayed in Valhalla, New York, with some other missionaries, waiting until the ships, were available that had sailors that could man them to take them to Brazil.
Folklorist Martha Emmons remembers escaping the flu.
I have often thought that the Lord in His providence kept me from having the flu. I used to give a more earthy explanation than that. People ask me how I avoided it because old people just got dead all around from that. But I was so needed, I thought. I had my father with me, and I was teaching, made for affection. And I remember when I was asked that, I said, "Oh, well, all I can attribute it to is eating onions and staying happy." And I did eat onions and anything else that way that I thought was the right kind of thing. And I did make an effort to stay happy. But I've often just thought it must have been a providential stroke, because I don't know what could have happened if I had had to have the flu right there with my father on invalid and with me, and we were in that little apartment there, and it would have been awful for him to take the flu from me.
The nationalism and acceptance of government authority heightened by the war allowed public health workers to easily put in place restrictive measures to bring the epidemic under control. The Spanish flu outbreak then faded from public memory until flu scares in recent decades. Living Stories is heard every Tuesday on 103.3 FM, Waco's NPR. For program transcripts or more information about the Institute for Oral History, visit baylor.edu/livingstories.
Oral histories. One thing that makes oral histories different from other types of primary sources is that oral histories are memories of events that have already occurred that we elicit from first-hand witnesses or participants of that events. Oral histories, like other primary sources, provide important evidence of past events, especially when documentary evidence of the event has not survived or was deliberately or unintentionally never produced. However, if we use oral history as primary sources, not at the time in which the event was remembered, but to reconstruct the events that were remembered, we must take into account that memory is frail. People forget things. And also, memory is often colored by the present circumstances in which we remember something. So, if we are recording oral histories, we have to give a lot of contextual information so that future historians can make sense and analyzing oral histories. So make sure that you will record when and how the oral history you collect were recorded, by whom, and under what conditions, since this information is important to historians in analyzing such records. If you transcribe instead of recording the interview, either through audio or video, make sure to include notes to convey the emotions of the speakers as you talk to them. I hope this guide is helpful, and I wish you the best of luck in staying safe and in recording this world historical.